A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. It's very good to see you and to welcome you here to this McDonald Centre symposium over the next couple of days, and a great personal pleasure to have you all here from near and far. And just want to say what it is a joy as well to have members of the McDonald family here as well, Al and Susie and Peter and other friends and colleagues. This subject, I think, could not be closer to my heart, and for those of you who have travelled far, thank you for bringing the weather with you, because it's been a bit patchy over the last few days, but it does put me in mind of an extraordinary passage in a little-known book by a man called Bruce Reed, who was a sort of practical theologian writing many, many years ago now, also happened to be a Jungian analyst, and much more besides. And about midway through his book, his only book called The Dynamics of Religion, he says, on a day like this, if you talk to the gardener about what the bees are doing, or you talk to other people about what the bees are doing, most people will say the bees are making honey, and there'll be honey aplenty. But if you talk to the gardener about what the bees are doing, the gardener will tell you in no uncertain terms that the honey is just a byproduct. What the bees are doing is cross-pollinating the flowers in the garden. They're going around from plant to plant, and they are producing the growth. And then he says, in the final sentence, the analogue between the bees in the garden and between church and society is what he wants to write about. In other words, he's really saying there's an awful lot of things we do in universities and institutions that are not our manifest intention, but they are the latent results of gathering. And I would have to say this is no less true in an institution like this. Of course, people come here because they want to get a great degree, a great life, a great career. I just put it to you that the latency of what they pick up here is arguably much more significant. My previous job, which was running a seminary, I used to say we only did three things. We learnt together, we ate together, and we worshipped together. And then I would argue, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, the most important thing you will actually do in this institution is eat together. Very Benedictine. Because when you eat together, you discover that the person you've been sitting next to over breakfast for the last 3 months is actually somebody you profoundly disagree with theologically. But actually you've been sharing sugar, milk, conversation, and some quite deep things. In other words, over the breakfast table, you are learning emotional intelligence. You are learning attentiveness. You are learning soft skills, which actually equip you for life far more, sometimes, than the overt, manifest degree programme or whatever else it might be what you're doing. And I would add to this and say that actually what you're learning at an institution like this are other things: civilization, cultivation, attentiveness, citizenship, character. So you don't just gain a degree by coming to a university like this. You gain a course in how to live life attentive to the other. You also gain a great deal in understanding the value of humility, something about wisdom, something about your place in the world and what it is you might have to offer your neighbour other than simply your world-class, first-class degree. As Professor Bigger will know, we sometimes talk about this institution as the house, and you don't have to go very far in the New Testament to know that one of the key motifs for the church is oikos, household, and from that we get words like ecology and economics, how to be responsible in the environment, how to be attentive with how we spend money, how to be eco-aware with our friends and our neighbours. Households are really important, and institutions that educate aspire to be generous, capacious households. I'd like to think that in this institution, and indeed in institutions across the world, we might, in our roles in higher education, really begin to understand that in the times in which we now live, which are, let's face it, vociferous, challenging, unstable, and can sometimes feel very, very difficult indeed. One of the things that institutions like this can do is school people into moderation, civilization, calmness, and a whole manner of other things, which makes me realise that actually, because you can't depend on politics and politicians in quite perhaps the way you might have wanted to, even a few years ago, the burden of responsibility falls on our museums, our galleries, our faith communities, and perhaps especially our universities and colleges. It is these places that are laying foundations about how to live civilised, attentive lives for the next 50, 75 years. And that will make a real difference to Project Humanity and to what that means to the way the rest of the world is shaped. So no pressure then. But in all seriousness, I do wish this conference very well indeed. I look forward to engaging with you over coffee and conversations at other times. I want to thank Nigel very much indeed, once again, as the director of the MacDonald Centre, for bringing this programme together, and Brad and others and all who've contributed to this in great teamwork. Thank you to our speakers, but particularly thank you to you for being here and for engaging with this agenda. It probably could not be more important in the time that we live. How to cultivate citizens of character in a modern world through our higher education with all the challenges we face. Thank you for being here. Enjoy your time and the sunshine. And don't be too busy bees. You'll get plenty of honey. But remember, it's all about the pollination. Thank you.
Well, there you have one head of a university college who doesn't need converting. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nigel Bigger. I am Director of the MacDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Life. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the conference, Cultivating Virtue in the University. This is the 9th annual May conference staged by the MacDonald Centre, the centre which is supported by an endowment funded by the MacDonald Agape Foundation. And as Martin mentioned earlier, we are fortunate to be graced with the presence of several MacDonalds. Alan Susie, who helped to pioneer the centre, Peter, who is now president of the MacDonald Agape Foundation. So on behalf of everyone present, let me thank you for all the support and you've given us, and for the vision that inspired it. We are indeed very pleased indeed to have you all with us. Thank you. The MacDonald Centre hosts a number of seminars and colloquia with scholars and practitioners throughout the academic year, but our conference in May each year is our main event, our high point. Last year we considered everyday ethics and whether it supplies a future for moral theology. The year before that we discussed what's wrong with rights, ? This year, the conference, which is organised in partnership with the Oxford Character Project and Wake Forest University in the United States, addresses the challenge of cultivating virtue in the university. Historically, moral formation has been one of the university's central purposes, but in the modern era, universities have become shy of intentionally shaping the character of their students, even if they do it in practice. Recent scandals and ethical failures in government, in politics, in banking, business, journalism, healthcare, and on the battlefield invite us to consider whether universities should recover an intentional focus on moral education, and if so, how they can do that, how they can cultivate virtue in a multicultural and ideologically plural society. This two-day conference brings together distinguished scholars and practitioners to explore the role of character development in higher education. By integrating perspectives from history, literature, philosophy, theology, and the social sciences, we hope to catalyse a broader interdisciplinary conversation that will encourage colleges and universities to develop creative ways to educate students to become good leaders and wise thinkers. The final session will be led by the Oxford Character Project as they present the theory and methodology that underlies their extremely successful work over the past 3 years with postgraduate students here in this university. And it will introduce some of the programme leaders, partners and students who've been involved in that project. By gathering distinguished scholars from across multiple disciplines to share pioneering research relevant to the theory and practice of character development in the university, we are hoping to promote the importance of character development in higher education. We also plan to produce an edited volume on cultivating virtue in the universities, which would disseminate research to a much broader audience. Just a word on the structure of the conference. The conference, as you will have gathered if you've scrutinised the programme, will proceed with each session devoted to the perspective of a particular academic discipline. Each session has 2 speakers, and you can find succinct biographies in your programmes. The chairs of each session have been instructed not to repeat everything in the programme. They will simply give bold introductions. And the speakers have been asked to speak for no more than 30 minutes, and chairs have been instructed to get rough, politely rough, if there's any major transgression. The reason for that is simply we want time available for discussion. We want time to involve you. So speakers will speak for 30 minutes and not much more. When it comes time to have general discussion, as far as you're able, please keep your comments and questions succinct. From my own experience, I know it's quite hard to formulate a succinct question or comment, but if you find yourself going for over 60 seconds, something's wrong. And again, the reason for that is lots of people want to take part. We need to give space to as many folk as possible. We're going to begin very shortly, but before we do it, I do need to offer some expressions of gratitude to a variety of bodies. We've already thanked the MacDonald Foundation, but in addition to them, a number of organisations and people who've been involved in making this conference possible do need upfront thanks. First of all, to Christchurch, who is hosting this event, to the Templeton World Charity Foundation for generously supporting the Oxford Character Project over the last 3 years and this conference. The MacDonald Centre is always very keen to multiply its effect by cooperating with other bodies. Last year, when we were discussing everyday ethics, we had a large contingent from the University of Virginia. This year, we're extremely pleased to be working in partnership with Wake Forest University. And we're delighted to have with us President Nathan Hatch, along with many trustees and friends of Wake Forest. At this point, I'm going to make a personal offer of thanks, because among the Wake Forest party are Don and Robin Flo, old friends of mine. We've known each other for about 40 years. But in 1979, they made a generous contribution to my career. And they also provided me air-conditioned refuge from the stifling heat of North Carolina. But Don and Robin, whatever I've become, for good or ill, is partly your responsibility. Others might not thank you. I do. Thanks too to Oxford University Press, which has published the work of many scholars in this room and is kindly sponsoring this evening's reception. Tom Perridge, Panamas King and Catherine Pugh have made that possible, and we're grateful. The UP has a book table with a number of titles available to order at a special conference discount, although I must confess when I came in the room it was looking a bit sparse, so I hope there's more items to go on the table. Reaching our climax, Martin thanked me and the MacDonald Centre for this event. The truth is, the pioneers of this event have been Jonathan Brandt and Michael Lamb in the Oxford Character Project. Michael Lamb has held a postdoctoral fellowship in the MacDonald Centre, but for the last year has been based at Wake Forest. But they have pioneered the concept and the organisation of the conference, and the administration has been carried by Claire Shuttleworth and Ginny Dunn, and to those four people in particular we owe a special debt of thanks. Finally, I want to thank all of you for attending, and all of our speakers and respondents and chairs for playing a part in this conference. Some of you have travelled from very far indeed to be here, from Hong Kong, Canada, the USA and parts of Europe. We're delighted to have you all. It really would not be the same without you. So thank you. Not seeing Ginny Dunn in the room, I take it we have no housekeeping matters to explain. Has anyone told you where the toilets are? If they haven't, it's through that door. And if there's a fire, there's that door and there's that one. Good. Enough of the preliminaries. Let's begin. So I'm going to hand over now to the chair of the first session, which is Nathan Hatch, President of Wake Forest University. Nathan, thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. I'm Nathan Hatch, President of Wake Forest University, and let me say on behalf of all of us from Wake Forest how privileged we are to be here, and grateful to all those who have supported this conference. I'm by training a historian, and so both as scholar and university president, I've long been interested in the moral purposes of a university. So I'm delighted to introduce our first session, which is Perspectives from History, which includes two leading historians of the modern university. Our first speaker is Chad Wellman, who's Associate Professor of Germanic Languages and Literature at the University of Virginia and a faculty fellow at UVA's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Chad.
So first of all, thank you, Michael and Jonathan, for organizing this conference and inviting me. And particular thanks to Claire, who arranged everything. So I'm sure Michael, you guys, and Jonathan, you did something, but Claire did a lot of it, so thank you. And I am going to repay that generous offer to come by, I guess, the only way to put it is putting the entire premise of the conference into question. So the title of my talk is On the Limits of Scholarly Virtue. And it's also, I do want to say, it's a real honor to be on a panel with Julie Rubin, whose work is extremely important for all of us, if you haven't read it, and I can't wait to hear you. So, On the Limits of Scholarly Virtue. In 1917, a group of German university students invited the renowned sociologist Max Weber to Munich to participate in a lecture series entitled Intellectual Work as Vocation, Geistige Arbeit als Beruf. The students met weekly in the back room of a bookstore as the Bavarian chapter of the National Federation of Independent Student Groups, a loose association of students established around 1900 to make sense of the radical changes that the German university had been undergoing for the past decades. Between 1880 and 1910, German universities' enrollments had doubled. Their expenditures had tripled, with most all of that money going to research labs and specialized institute seminars. And both teaching and research became, to the chagrin of faculty and students alike, much more specialized. By 1900, the university's defenders and detractors alike referred to their alma mater as a Großbetrieb, an industrial concern that produced knowledge through an increasingly differentiated division of intellectual labor. The students, the Munich students that is, wanted Weber to come and explain an institution that they no longer recognized. An institution that, as one critic put it, had transformed the very idea of intellectual vocation into, and I'm quoting here, a corrupting monstrosity. Is it possible, wrote the president of the student group, to devote oneself completely to this unending task, that is Geistige Arbeit, and still remain in this world? Is intellectual work still possible as a vocation? And that was the invitation issued to Weber. So in a modern world characterized by the division of labor, constant economic expansion, and unrelenting change, could universities sustain a morally robust and socially distinct way of life? Now, by accepting this invitation, Weber agreed to weigh in on a decades-long debate about the fate of moral education in the modern university, and the broader cultural anxiety that Wissenschaft, specialized knowledge, had eclipsed Bildung, moral formation. Now, a quick aside about the German term Wissenschaft. Wissenschaft, of course, doesn't simply mean the natural or physical sciences, but any systematic inquiry. So just think, when I'm going to stick with the term Wissenschaft throughout the talk, but when I say that, what I mean in particular is specialized research of any kind, humanities, natural or physical sciences. So the anxiety was that specialized research had eclipsed moral formation. So since the 1870s, faculty members and intellectuals worried that universities had encouraged overly specialized, or to use the term of the day, micrological research. That universities overwhelmed students with too much information, and that they did all of this without providing any coherent account of knowledge, much less any coherent account of their lives. And more fundamentally, students couldn't answer the most basic questions of meaning and value. This was the contention of the group that invited Weber to speak in Munich. Research universities produced human capital for a modern state. They did not form persons for good lives. Now, the rapid rise of research universities in the United States, such as Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago, and the reinvention of Harvard and Michigan, prompted similar anxieties. But whereas Germans spoke of the increasing difference between Wissenschaft and Bildung, the Americans framed their concern as the distinction between universities and colleges. Universities produced specialized research and participated in international disciplinary communities, whereas colleges formed character and instilled virtue in local communities. So you had this kind of universal versus local imagination in the American college debate. And so by the 1890s, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, contended that the research university had eclipsed the college in both size and stature. And this gap now threatened the integrity of American undergraduate education. With the rise of research universities from Berlin to Baltimore, higher education had decoupled the pursuit of knowledge from questions of value and meaning, and thus abandoned the primary historical purpose of all institutions of higher education, that is, the moral education of young people. In the rest of my talk, I'm going to challenge this long-standing narrative that I've just laid out, right, that I've invoked here, and argue for a different understanding of the place of virtue in the university. When Weber lectured in 1917 on the fate of what the students called intellectual work as vocation, those present heard a version of what we know today as his famous essay, Science as Vocation. And so they heard Weber suggest that specialized scholarship or Wissenschaft had nothing to say about the ultimate questions that drove their lives. That specialized scholarship had nothing to offer on matters of value. And that modern knowledge was, to use his famous phrase, meaningless, sinnlos. And ever since critics and defenders, is there a way to, I don't know, I don't have it, oh, is it this? Just turn it down. Okay. Cool. All right. And ever since, critics and defenders alike, is that still not? I think it's good. Yeah, okay. And ever since, critics and defenders alike have accused Weber and Science as Vocation as exemplifying the moral agnosticism of a value-free science. And defending the hopelessness of a bureaucratic, hyper-rationalized modernity. And so it would seem perhaps odd that I'm going to turn to Weber in defense of a crucial account of the relationship between virtue and the modern university. Weber, despite what we've come to know, it's his 100th year anniversary of his lecture, despite all of this, seemed to have deeply impressed those present at the lecture there in 1917. Weber's effect on all of us that day, wrote the philosopher Karl Löwe, who was there, was, quote, staggering. Everything Weber said was summoned, and I'm quoting directly from Löwe, was summoned directly from deep within and thought through with a critical intellect, and violently so. His words were haunted by a human gravity that lent him personality. So, and then I'm quoting this account, this first-person account of Weber's lecture. His words were haunted by a human gravity that lent him personality. His refusal to answer easy questions was matched only by the acuity of his questions. His words, Leverth wrote, redeemed us. Now, in recalling his experience in Munich, Leverth described not just Max Weber, the famed sociologist of Western modernity, but the ideal, modern, if perhaps very German scholar. Biting, critical, and disciplined, but also humane, imaginative, and passionate. Weber embodied, that is, the singular virtue of an institution presumed to have no virtue at all, what he called intellectual rectitude, intellektuelle Rechtschaffenheit. The purpose of the university, Weber argued in Munich, was, and I'm quoting directly from his lecture here, was to cultivate in students one virtue, intellectual rectitude. And like generations of German scholars, Weber associated the scholarly virtue with Wissenschaft, or specialized knowledge. One of the first defenders of Wissenschaft as a distinct epistemic and ethical tradition was Wilhelm von Humboldt, the early 19th century scholar and bureaucrat who helped establish the University of Berlin. Humboldt argued that specialized scholarship, what today we might call university-based knowledge and research, formed a particular type of person and was sufficient to fund not only a specialized or professional career, but a coherent and self-sustaining form of life. Wissenschaft, in Humboldt's words, was Bildung. Specialized knowledge just was moral character. Bildung, from the German bilden, to form, and Bild, image or imago, had for most of the 18th century referred to a process of moral or ethical formation, the process through which a person formed himself and was formed in accord with exemplary images, or moral exemplars. But whereas the moral exemplars of the 18th century had been either classical figures such as Cicero or Christian ones such as Christ, Humboldt presented the modern specialized scholar as the most apposite moral exemplar. Wissenschaft, wrote Nietzsche's teacher and renowned philologist Ritschl, was and I'm quoting from Ritschl here, the greatest means of moral education because Wissenschaft gave students truth and made them good. Now, I just want to pause for a moment. And yes, this is what they're claiming. The claim here is that academic research is the most apposite and most exemplary form of life. Right? Detailed attention to which you devote yourself to a Greek preposition is the highest ethical form. I find that odd, even though I've been reading this stuff for many years. But that was the claim, right? So for most of the 19th century, German scholars considered philology the exemplary science, because philology, according to their thinking, was the discipline to first develop epistemic and ethical ideals. Philology, again exemplifying what a real specialized science was autonomous. It had, wrote Ritschl, again Nietzsche's teacher, it had freed itself from theology and the state and could, quote, stand on its own 2 feet. And autonomy in this instance meant that philology could articulate and support its own internal goods and practices that made it possible. The other epistemic ideal, philology reconceived of knowledge as research, Forschung. Unlike the philologists and classicists of early European humanism, the philologist of the 19th century conceived of knowledge not as erudition, that is, the display of a given form of knowledge, but the endless pursuit of knowledge. These epistemic ideals, autonomy and research, had distinct ethical entailments. They helped shape the daily pursuit of knowledge and the type of person thought to be required to excel in such a task. German philologists linked epistemic value to epistemic virtue. An essay or a book was scholarly because a scholar wrote it, and thus was the creation of a person with a particular type of virtue. So who was this ideal scholar, the embodiment of Weber's intellectual rectitude? Well, first of all, that ideal scholar was critical. In 1869, the historian and then secretary of the Prussian Academy of the Sciences, Theodor Mommsen, defined critique as follows. And I don't like to do this, but I'm going to read a short passage from him because it's so peculiar, you just have to hear it for yourself. Right? So this is how Mommsen defined critique and thus defined the ideal, not just scholar, but person. Okay, so critique is the so-called, and I'm quoting directly from Mommsen here, is the so-called rigorous philological method. That simply means the ruthlessly honest pursuit of the truth, Wahrheitsforschung, that in both big and small things doesn't shy away from any toil, that doesn't buckle before any doubt, that doesn't paint over any gaps in the tradition or its own knowledge, and that gives an account of itself and of others. And it means carrying this method, this critical method, into other areas in which a sloppy and dishonest dilettantism has long predominated, in which buzzwords and quackery have grown all too common. Right? And it just because I'm in Oxford and Christchurch in particular, and I did this once before with Nigel, of course, the embodiment of that was the English gentleman scholar. Right? But not anymore. Right? So this is the definition of critique that Mommsen uses. Critique referred then not just to a method, but to an ethos. Critique wasn't simply something you did. Critique was something that you were. Ruthless, honest, truth-seeking, strong, thorough, brave, careful, and single-minded. A scholar was critical, but a dilettante, in contrast, was uncritical, and therefore, yes, here the moral opprobrium, lazy, shallow, sloppy, unfocused, and inattentive. A sloppy scholar was a distracted scholar. So, the ideal scholar was critical. The ideal scholar was rigorous and disciplined. Everything had to be repeatedly tested over and over again. The ideal scholar was industrious and tireless. Intellectual or scholarly goods were primarily attained not through grace or its secular analog genius, but rather through hard work. Modern scholars, as one 19th century scientist, and this was a scientist put it, would never reach, and I'm quoting here, no scholar would ever reach an everlasting period of rest in which they could give themselves over to unending contemplation. There was no eschatological future in which to hope for a scholar. There was only work in the eternal present. But the ideal scholar, lest I leave you with the bad image of the German scholar, was all of this, but also profoundly intuitive and imaginative. The philologist's historical critical method required understanding and empathy, because how else were you to bridge decades, centuries, millennia when you're engaging in these ancient texts? Rightly practiced, philology was a path to transcendence, but a transcendence and communion not with the God of Protestant theology, but rather with, to quote one philologist, a communion with the dead. And if you think that's crazy, Julia Rubin's colleague at Harvard, Stephen Greenblatt, he's a scholar of Shakespeare. That's how he describes his work in trying to speak with Shakespeare. I heard him do it 3 weeks ago at Stanford. He communes with the dead. We still hold dear to these principles. So the ideal scholar was intuitive and imaginative. The ideal scholar was also faithful to tradition. These historical critical practices required a certain faith in the continuity of historical ideas, the idea that the text of the past could be passed on continuously through time and be made meaningful for those in the present. But what could support such a faith in a faithless age? In short, method. Right? It's a salvific notion of method. As practiced in the seminars of 19th century German universities, method was a form of catechesis that focused students' attention not only on text, but onto themselves. Method cultivated in students a constant reflection on their own actions, desires, and personality. Philological virtue, Weber's intellectual rectitude, had to be instilled through a long process of formation, or, as Ritschl referred to it, again, Nietzsche's teacher, Zucht, or breeding. Good scholars had to be bred. But most importantly, method brought philologists together. It instilled in them, again quoting Ritschl, a consciousness that their capacities and activities were, quote, only a link in a much bigger chain. Scholarly virtue was oriented towards transcendence in the form of the timeless community of scholars, towards a truth that was always deferred. And yet, method, intellectual rectitude, and critique had their limits. In a letter to a university friend and fellow philologist around 1870, Friedrich Nietzsche described his teacher and Doktorvater Friedrich Ritschl as a wissenschaftliches Gewissen, as a scholarly conscience. Right? Nietzsche's training in the philology seminar under Ritschl hadn't just given him tools to read ancient text, it had formed who he had become and instilled within him ascetic ideals of self-control, conscientiousness, discipline, attention to detail, self-critique, and, as Mommsen had put it, defining critique, a ruthlessly honest pursuit of the truth. And so before Nietzsche described the bad conscience of the Christian, right, in the genealogy of morals, he had described the bad conscience of critical philologists. And then just to quote, to see where Nietzsche takes this very briefly, He asked in Beyond Good and Evil, but what in us wants truth so badly? What was the value of intellectual rectitude and philological critique in its unblinking commitment to Wahrheit, or the truth, as he put it? As soon as Nietzsche arrived at the University of Basel in 1867 as a 24-year-old professor of ancient Greek literature, he began to doubt the moral and intellectual value of specialized scholarship, and thus the underlying premise of the modern university, that Wissenschaft was Bildung, that specialized research just was moral formation, that specialized scholarship could sustain a distinct form of life. And Nietzsche, writing in the 1870s about this, wasn't the only scholar to do so. After the founding of the German Reich in 1871, the German university changed dramatically. As I mentioned earlier, it became less a scholastic monastery and more a Großbetrieb, more an industrial concern. Mommsen worried that the modern university, with its specialized scholarship, produced alienated workers who had no idea of the end for which they labored. And Rudolf Virchow, a German physiologist, warned natural scientists that they were Halbwisser, half-knowers, with the faintest idea of the whole. Their lives, like their work, were incoherent and fragmented. And so Nietzsche, Mommsen, and Virchow argued for a constrained vision of Wissenschaft, of what it could do, but also what it couldn't do. And this is the tradition, I think, that Weber takes up in 1917. On a trip to the United States in 1904, Weber toured a number of American colleges and universities, Northwestern, University of Chicago, and Haverford among them. He returned to Germany intrigued in particular by what he called the ethos or culture of American colleges, especially the emphasis they placed on forming moral character. And Weber spent the next 13 years, I would suggest, considering the difference between two types of education: an education oriented towards moral character, that he saw bound up and defined by the American college, and one oriented towards professional training, the professional training needed in advanced industrial societies. And he saw the battle going on in the US between research universities and American colleges as the embodiment of this battle at the center of rational modernity. Now, Weber's thinking culminated in his response to the student group in Munich in his lecture, Science as Vocation. By 1917, Weber had concluded that traditional moral education, be it the German Bildung or the American collegiate ideal, could not be fully reconciled with modern knowledge, and definitely not with the modern university. The unity of humanistic Bildung and Wissenschaft, the underlying premise of the entire German higher education system, was no longer tenable. And so, he told those gathered in the lecture hall in Munich, "Our aim must be to enable students to discover the vantage point from which he can judge the matter in the light of his own ultimate ideals. But ideals that the students didn't simply invent him or herself, but the ideals that the students received not from the university and its myriad and fragmented disciplines, but from elsewhere, from institutions and tradition outside the university. Specialized scholarship and thus the university offered no answers to life's ultimate questions. Wissenschaft," Weber famously wrote, "was meaningless because it could not answer the two most basic questions." And here I'm quoting Weber again. He's actually quoting Tolstoy. The two most basic questions. Wissenschaft cannot answer what we should do and how we should live. "Do not turn to modern science," he told his students, "in search of answers for the ultimate and deepest personal decisions about your lives." So for a century now, critics have seized on what they consider Weber's account of a diminished and morally impotent Wissenschaft, or modern knowledge project. As one of his contemporaries put it in 1919, Weber had separated Wissenschaft from its primary end, quote, "the formation of humanity." But moving towards the conclusion here, I want to ask, in what sense was modern knowledge sinnless or meaningless? Weber considered Wissenschaft an ethical tradition, the guardian of intellectual rectitude and scholarly practices. And he insisted that the university could still accomplish something. The university, etwas leisten, is what he said. So what exactly could the university do and what couldn't it do? First, Wissenschaft in the modern university could not ground itself. Neither Wissenschaft or the modern university was the bearer of ultimate values that could lend it authority and legitimacy. The values that motivated a student to devote himself to Wissenschaft were ultimately external to Wissenschaft itself or to the university. The legitimacy, authority, and flourishing of modern knowledge required scholars to look elsewhere for value. There's a motivational deficit, to use kind of a contemporary parlance. It could never adequately answer the question, why knowledge. Number two, in this notion that Wissenschaft couldn't ground itself, it made Wissenschaft extremely fragile. Weber's contemporaries turned to Wissenschaft to create values and renew, as they put it, the whole of man. Right? This call that science, modern science, be value-creating was everywhere in the early part of the 20th century. But Weber feared that Wissenschaft could not bear such weighty moral demands and worried that those who wanted more from what they called the new science would undermine whatever integrity, coherence, and goods that Wissenschaft properly practiced could offer. Number three, Wissenschaft also demanded a certain kind of faith, or at the very least, a certain kind of trust. Modern science, of course, as Weber famously wrote, had disenchanted the modern world. Everything could, at least in principle, be explained. We no longer had to stare in dumb wonder at the movements of the stars, or tremble in terrorizing fear of the ocean, because we could explain nature. But such explanations, I would say, didn't extinguish belief and wonder. They merely shifted the object of wonder and awe. Not everyone could explain everything. Only scientists could do that. And even then, only in principle. So the word disenchantment is actually kind of a bad translation of Entzauberung. It's actually a demagicked world. A demagicked world required belief, maybe not in nature or a god, but it required belief in expertise and specialized knowledge. And that was a wondrous, but also, warned Weber, a very dangerous thing. The limits of science had to be articulated, and they also had to be respected. Weber's disenchanted science was a warning against prophets posing as scholars, declaiming moral truths in the name of Wissenschaft in lecture halls where their charismatic authority might well go unchecked. So, nice story, Chad, thanks. But what does this have to do with universities today? In the United States, you may have heard, university campuses are currently roiled in protests, walkouts, and very public condemnations. Everybody is condemning everybody. And part of this has to do, I think, with the fact that, and Nigel, I don't know if this may well be the case in the UK, but in the United States, I feel like people, in a matter of months, have dropped their shyness about talking in moral language. In fact, I think what we're witnessing now is the return with a vengeance of a moralizing from all sides that I find deeply troubling. And that's from academic leaders, faculties, and students, right? This attempt to recover, but I would say rather unreflectively, older modes of moral education as a way of making the case for the university's public values. So, I'll just use one example. In her commencement speech last year, Harvard's president Drew Gilpin-Faust spoke bluntly of her fears arising from the, and I'm quoting from her here, the tumultuous state of American politics. And then she proceeded to tell the class of 2016, and I'm quoting here, with the rise of the research university in the late 19th and early 20th century, moral and ethical purposes came to be seen as at odds with the scientific thinking transforming higher education. But in today's world, I believe it is dangerous for universities not to fully acknowledge and embrace their responsibilities to values and to service, as well as to reason and discovery. So as President Faust thinks about how to put this thought into practice, I'd suggest that she and all of us remember Weber's reflections on moral education in a modern age, from which I draw 3 points in conclusion. First, the university does have its own ethical practices and resources. What I've described today is Weber's intellectual rectitude and the longer tradition of philological critique in Wissenschaft. And I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about how these were adopted and adapted in an American context, because I would contend they absolutely were. Not fully adopted, but adapted. We need to recognize and defend these traditions as the internal goods, virtues, and practices that they are. So, for example, contrary to what Stanley Fish would argue, I would argue that scholarly values and practices aren't simply bureaucratic or professional procedures. Right? They are robust epistemic virtues embedded in historical practices, and they provide those within and outside the university with essential goods. So one, the research university has its own ethical traditions. Number two, I would also argue that these traditions and practices are insufficient, and the institution that maintains them, the university, has clear moral limitations. Under the conditions of a pluralistic modernity, universities cannot impart comprehensive visions of the good. I say that both descriptively and normatively. They cannot provide ultimate moral ends. The goods of universities are proximate, not ultimate. And so universities, number 3, universities, given 1 and 2, that they have their own traditions, given that they are insufficient, have clear moral limitations, I would conclude by saying that universities need to look outside themselves and host within themselves partnerships with other moral traditions and resources. Universities may not be able to impart comprehensive visions of the good, but they are uniquely, I would say perhaps singularly positioned, given their own practices and traditions, to sustain encounters between and among traditions and help students develop capacities to engage in debates and articulate their own deepest commitments, right? Kind of an ethics of articulacy a la Charles Taylor. These conversations that take their deepest and oftentimes conflicting values very seriously and do not conceal them under the mantra of a vague liberal neutrality, whatever that might be. But I think that veil has already been dropped in the U.S., so maybe that's over. That was like a debate 20 years ago. I think in the past 6 months, maybe I'm totally wrong. Julie, I'd be interested to hear what you think. And so just in conclusion, virtue, scholarly or otherwise, has its limits. Thanks.
Thank you, Chad. Our second speaker this morning is Julie Rubin, who's the Charles Warren Professor of History of American Education at Harvard University. Julie.
Thank you very much. Is this now working? Okay, hello. I'm so pleased to be here and honored to be here. I really thank the organizers of this conference for including me as part of it. And I thank Chad for his interesting talk. I'm going to be talking about the history of the attempt to keep morality central in higher education, university, and the college in the United States. Chad talked about the college and the university as being somewhat separate in the United States, and that providing perhaps a solution to the problem of science scholarship itself having virtues, but its product, the knowledge it produces, not having any moral answers. Those moral answers would have to come from without. And so that somehow this separation maybe solve that, where the college could be the source of moral training and the university could be the source of the moral training of the scholar through those processes of scholarship, but that the products that they produced didn't have moral value. This idea really has a false idea of American higher education, where the university and the college somehow are really separate. There is a separation, but it is not as true as this ideal would make it. First of all, the college and many colleges are within universities. And second of all, the people within universities are all, within colleges are all trained within universities. And they bring their practices and assumptions to collegiate teaching, to undergraduate teaching. And colleges adopt the standards of judgment and for promotion and for things like that that are derived from the university. So even though there is a kind of conceptual difference between the college and the university, the college is intertwined with the university in a way that makes its own attempt to have a moral core problematic. And so I'm going to talk some about the history of Americans' efforts to grapple with how do you keep some kind of moral presence in collegiate education that is completely tied and intertwined with the modern intellectual, scientific, scholarly values of the university. And often we fall back on a very simple answer, and we rely on it, and it's sort of a derivative of this idea that scholarship itself has a kind of morality in it. And we often sort of say that, well, universities, colleges, or undergraduate education provides critical thinking. And we sort of assume that some of the virtues of scholarship, of science, the virtues of searching and study and careful examination and argument and revision, that those sort of the processes of science and scholarship that we see as having some kind of moral formation, that we provide those to our students, and they walk away, graduate with being critical thinkers. And that's our kind of default answer to does undergraduate, does college, does the college part of a university education provide moral training? And we often fall back on that. And we've been falling back on it for a century and a half. But in the United States, there's also, and I think this conference shows that across the world, there's also a little bit of a sense that, is that adequate? Is the idea that we just sort of give students some of a version of the values that we see in the scientific or the scholarly persona, and that's enough. But that we don't provide the scholarship that they learn, the knowledge they learn, doesn't provide any moral guidance. And there's always been a little bit of discomfort and a bit of a search for something more, some kind of content to the moral education we provide students. And that search, that desire exists in the United States. I assume it exists elsewhere, else we wouldn't be having this conference. But the history of searching for it has been very problematic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that history and some of the attempts to solve this problem, and how why some of those attempts haven't fully survived, and why in the contemporary world some of the aspects of universities in the contemporary world amplify the problem. So let me go back in time. Colleges in the United States obviously were derived from England. The colonists that built the colleges in the United States had mainly gone to Cambridge, and they were thinking of their experience in England when they created colleges in the United States. And they basically imitated the English college in curriculum, but not really in governance. Instead of being governed by the faculty, the college in the colonies was governed by an outside board, originally made up of a combination of leaders of the colony, leaders of the colonial government, and ministers. And this board represented a belief that the college should not become totally internally, should not be internally sustained, but that it should always answer to some outside authorities, particularly religious authorities. This was an attempt to ensure that the colleges maintain their religious orthodoxy, however that was defined in a particular time and place. So morality was front and center in the original colleges in North America, but it was almost completely enfolded in a Christian theology. over time, colleges came to move to bring in rational philosophy, rational thought, and integrate it with Christian ideas through the development of moral philosophy. And over time, moral philosophy really displaced theology in the curriculum, but moral philosophy was taught in a Christian theistic framework, broadly conceived. And this vision of providing students a broadly Christian but also rational moral education through moral philosophy persisted in the United States to the end of the 19th century. However, in the 19th century, the colleges themselves, the way the colleges were organized, having a required curriculum that everyone studied that was based in Latin and Greek and mathematics and culminated in moral philosophy, that collegiate form came under criticism throughout the 19th century. And by the middle of the 19th century, the critics started to gain enough momentum, enough support, that they started to be able to not replace that college, but create another kind of institution, which we now call the research university, that offered a different vision. And the critique of that old college that culminated in moral philosophy there were several critiques of it. One of it was that a big part of it was that required set curriculum they thought was both too narrow and too superficial. They worried that it didn't suit the modern age, that it didn't have modern subjects, enough time for modern subjects. And they worried that America was becoming completely derivative in its scholarship because the colleges had this required curriculum and there was no space for developing original scholarship. They also thought that the colleges needed to be more independent, that they shouldn't be controlled by ministers, they should be controlled by educators. So this critique envisioned a different version of higher education, a university. They wanted it to be free from outside control. And how they defined this was that they wanted it to be non-sectarian, which what they meant was that a particular church didn't control it. And they wanted it to be non-partisan, meaning that it wasn't controlled by a political party. They wanted it to be autonomous and neutral. And in practice, what this meant originally was that you didn't give any religious tests to the faculty or to students, that to be part of this community, to teach in this community, you didn't have to conform to any set of outside set of beliefs defined by a church or a political party. So that was the kind of negative idea of being neutral. And then in a more positive idea, what that would mean in practice was that there was an open curriculum, that students had choice and to choose what they wanted to study, and that this open curriculum included modern subjects. Also in practice, that the teachers in these colleges and universities would be experts. They would have themselves gone through that formation, that scholarly formation, and they would know their subject because they had gone through that. And the expert faculty would follow a method understood as the scientific method at that time. And this method involved openness, open inquiry, empirical verification. So you could ask any question you wanted, you could question any truth, but then you had to answer it with empirical evidence, and that it would be progressive, that it would move towards truth. Now, this idea of openness and progress turned out not to work out so well, because how did you ever get to an end? How did you ever know that a question was answered? And the original resolution to this idea of openness, but getting to a resolution, came with the idea of consensus or agreement. So William James at one point said, and I'm quoting, that the only safeguard for the fallibility of science is in the final consensus of our farther knowledge about the thing in question, later views correcting earlier ones until at last the harmony of a consistent system is reached. So this idea that we'd be open, we'd verify, and we'd make progress, but progress would come when there was agreement, turned out to be a very serious sort of issue, because all of this method tended not to reach agreement. It tended to create disagreement. So originally, these reformers had hoped that applying this method would modernize religion, that it would create a certain basis for morality, and that it would, through its inquiry, solve the basic problems of humanity. And in some ways, it had a lot of success. These new research-oriented universities had a lot of growth in terms of material resources. They became wealthier through gifts and through government support. They became more popular. Lots of students went to them. And they did create new knowledge and increase expertise. They provided better professional training. But they sort of failed in some of their other goals. The scientific study of religion didn't modernize religion. It didn't create or come to some consensus about what were universal religious truths. And instead, it sort of accepted the Weberian two worlds kind of thing, and sort of said that students and others could pursue any kind of religious practice they wanted in private, but the university itself didn't provide those religious answers. A second disappointment, and perhaps the more serious one, was that science, inquiry, didn't really provide clear moral answers. So what happened was this idea that consensus would show when we made progress meant that the failure of consensus made the sciences seem like failures. So disagreements seemed to undermine the authority of scientific inquiry. And the sciences responded to this by trying to answer narrower questions, trying to develop more technical methods, and eschewing large moral questions. And we see this change in biology and the social sciences from the early 20th century to sort of the decades of the 20s and 30s. And social scientists were also pushed in this direction of more narrow technical things by various academic freedom cases, where social scientists who were taking moral positions, radical moral positions, found themselves in trouble with the university. And so the social scientists sort of followed the biologists in wanting non-controversial studies, making incremental progress through careful study, seeking methodologies that were replicable and testable. And so this left the universities without leadership from their faculty about how to provide moral questions, because increasingly the idea of scholarly practice was towards specialization and technicality, not towards answering large questions. So how did the universities respond when they tried to keep some real moral content to the education. And in answering these questions, I want to point to you to an ambiguity in the meaning of neutral. So universities wanted to be neutral, they wanted to be autonomous. But neutral could kind of mean sort of two things. If you're thinking about an argument, the neutral ground is the place of agreement. But if you're thinking about a war, the neutral party is the one that doesn't participate. They don't have favoritism, they don't take sides. So the idea of neutral could mean an area of a consensus or agreement, or it could mean the acceptance of disagreement and just allowing all different parties to disagree. So does that make sense? So there's two ideas of neutrality, a consensual idea of neutrality and a pluralistic idea of neutrality. And the pluralistic idea is just accepting anything that exists, being a kind of marketplace of ideas. And the consensual one is like looking for the areas of agreement. And I think in the middle decades of the 20th century, American higher education for the collegiate level, but the college connected to the university, in the sense that the knowledge was still being created in universities and the professors, the teachers, were from the university. In the middle decades of the 20th century, I think American universities tried to build on this consensual idea of neutrality. And they accepted this idea of service to the nation. And so through the Depression, through World War I, through the Depression, through World War II, through the Cold War, they thought of service to the nation as a consensual area of morality, and that what served the nation could be the answer of what was good. And so they provided a curriculum around educating democratic citizens. And there was a lot of debate about what this education of democratic citizens entailed. So it wasn't like there was total agreement, but there was sort of agreement on the general purpose. And in the middle decades of the 20th century, American higher education developed what was called general education. And that was seen as sort of the area where students were turned into democratic citizens. And the content of that devolved or evolved around this idea of teaching the history of Western civilization. And that involved a kind of a view, a history of what they at the time thought was the history of democracy. And so they wanted to create American democratic citizens by teaching the history of democracy through the history of Western civilization, and teaching that through great works of literature, through works of philosophy that struggled with and came to some answers for, how do you live in a democratic community. And they also tried to train students to be democratic citizens through outside the classroom by training them to be responsible citizens within the university or college. So in this period, there's a lot of attention to building like student government, giving students practice in governing themselves, limited practice where they were supervised and shown how to be responsible. And this consensus idea of neutrality dominated for the middle decades of the 20th century. But the 1960s activism brought this consensus idea under sharp critique. So activists said this idea of political neutrality, that there's some kind of consensus, was a myth. And they said, no, instead, universities they weren't a neutral body teaching a consensus idea of what is good. They were actually tools of the power, tools of the status quo. And they said that we wanted to change the university to make it not a tool of the status quo, but instead to make it a tool of political change. So the activists, in a sense, engaged in a moral battle with the universities. And universities responded by changing their notion of neutrality to that pluralistic ideal. So universities responded by really adopting the pluralistic idea of neutrality, where anything could exist in the university, and the university was just a marketplace of ideas. And this actually expanded the freedom of speech within universities for both students and faculty, because we no longer had to be in this consensus space. There could be a much broader set of, but it pulled back the university to not being looking for any kind of stand. And so I think really the decades of the 1970s and the 1980s are, in a sense, the nadir of American higher education trying to find some moral education, and instead just becoming a marketplace of ideas. From the 1990s on, there started to be a recognition of the problem of just this kind of marketplace idea. And so there was a revival and concern about moral and civic development, and a renewal in a desire for there to be a return to general education, which had largely been dropped in the late 1960s and 70s as a kind of a sort of token response to student criticism. So when they renewed the focus on general education, some people said that we should go back to old Western civilization, and some people said, no, that is too limited a view, and that we should instead have a kind of multicultural general education. And that, of course, created cultural wars that universities found themselves battled in the 1990s and beyond. But still, I think there was some progress in attempts to create civic education, so like service learning and other attempts to get students involved in the community. Universities sort of tried to find some way to provide more moral guidance for their students. And they still are. But the context is making this difficult. I think that the context that is making it difficult in the United States is severe financial uncertainty. So the cost of higher education is increasing. The support for higher education by government is decreasing. And there have developed competition among universities to distinguish themselves. And we all see that with the various kinds of rankings and now world rankings. And these ranking systems lead universities to try and make universities very much worry about distinguishing themselves in some way and being different. And so that creates an environment where it's very hard for universities to come together and try to find what is the consensual ground for this period in time. And I think that is the problem ahead of us. To not just say, we live in a world of pluralism and we are going to be a neutral ground and just let every party speak, but try to return to some of that ideal of neutral as a consensus, an area of agreement. But that will never be fully done. What was achieved in the middle decades of the 20th century was was unstable, but it was something. It engaged students in thinking about their place in the world and their responsibilities to the world. And we need to try to find that again. But all of the financial pressures and the competition is working against that, because that involves not just a single university figuring out how to make itself different, how to have something unique that can attract students, but how to cooperate among universities, among the people within universities, and find in our pluralistic world what we can agree on that we can teach our students. Thank you.
We now have time for questions. So there are volunteers with microphones, so if you have a question, if you raise your hand and use the microphone. So the floor is open.
Thank you both, Chad and Julie. Is this working? I have a brief question for each of you. First of all, Chad, your remark about how, in a sense, the relaxation of inhibitions about expressing moral views on campus is now a problem. I think before the end suggested that. And it's a problem here as well as in your country, insofar as it is intemperate, very intemperate.
I didn't say that, but
You didn't say that, yeah.
just interjecting.
Fine. Yeah. That's my interpretation. Yeah. Okay. So we agree in that, but if you were implying that therefore calls into question whether the university should be in the business of articulating moral virtues, I disagree, because I think part of the problem is that we've always had more or less fierce moral and political controversy among students. We certainly had it in the 1960s. But the problem is that we've not trained our students how to handle passionate controversy virtuously. Somehow, whatever we taught in the classroom doesn't appear in the bar or the student union or whatever. So, insofar as you were suggesting that intemperate political controversy suggests moral controversy suggests actually we should keep out of the moral business. I think that's certainly not what I would include. And then, Julie, thank you for raising the issue of the meaning of neutrality, because I think it's really important. And it struck me when you were talking about American colleges in the 1850s and mid-19th century, in effect relaxing religious and political tests. That's one kind of neutrality. So we have neutral gates. You can come into the college regardless of your political religious views, moral views, which is different from saying once you're in the university, as a teacher, for example, you're not allowed to express your religious or moral views in the classroom. That's different. And I'm wondering if the latter developed and how it developed. If the notion that neutrality means basically teachers need to stand back and be quiet about their own personal convictions in the classroom.
Okay, so in the United States, the tradition of academic freedom has evolved in various ways, but the original articulation of academic freedom said that scholars should be absolutely free in their area of scholarship. But in the classroom, they also should be careful in a couple of ways. They should teach what they believe to be the truth, but they should explain the dissenting views to students. And they should keep out of the classroom their ideas that are outside the subject that they teach. And so those were a set of sort of rules about inside the classroom that were articulated by the AAUP, the organization, when they were describing academic freedom. And they also had a sort of set of rules for faculty in the civic realm, in outside, in the community. And they said that university professors, of course, had to be able to be citizens, but in their role as citizens, they should be aware of behaving in a manner that is professionally acceptable, that they should always speak with reason and with temperance, with an attention to facts. They should, in a sense, represent their professional persona, even when they were in the political sphere. So the original conceptions of academic freedom in the United States didn't give university professors complete freedom of speech. That would come later. They gave them limited political freedom, that they had to continue to behave in a professional manner, and they gave them guidelines for classroom behavior. And then they said that they're absolutely free in their scholarly work.
Can I respond? Nigel, I think I didn't make myself clear, because I think we're probably fully in agreement that universities, precisely, my argument would be, should engage in these debates. But the distinction that I want to draw, especially given kind of both historically my concerns, but also given contemporary concerns, is that we, kind of universities, academics, should do so with an acute awareness of the moral limitations of the university, right? So, which doesn't at all mean that I think the university should be, given its history, uniquely positioned to facilitate discussion, engagement, and discussion precisely about our deepest conflicts, right? But what I'm concerned about, and why I think Weber is kind of a posit for a moment, is that he had an acute awareness, I would say, also like Cardinal Newman and the idea of the university, of the clear moral limitations of the university insofar as universities, I would say University of Virginia, where I teach, I have deep doubts and disagreements with some of my colleagues that we can provide comprehensive visions of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right? We can provide, and I think we ought to provide, and this is kind of my take, really robust practices, internal goods, and virtues, and ideally form our students in those, but those are proximate, not ultimate goods. And it's precise, and that's why I call it the need for partnerships. Think kind of the third lecture of McIntyre's through rival versions, right? It's something has a conflictual model. I think we have resources to not necessarily have to go that route. But no, it's a call for an acute awareness of our moral limitations, precisely so that within the scholarly practices which universities hopefully defend, we can sustain rigorous and robust kind of moral disagreement. But my concern, I just led for the past 3 years a reform of the University of Virginia's entire undergraduate curriculum. And what I felt like I discovered is that my colleagues, myself included, we have no moral vocabulary. That is, we do not understand how to talk about what we do in terms of goods, in terms of responsibilities, in terms of practices. And I try to encourage my colleagues in this debate to recognize what they do as precisely engaging in a really robust moral activity, but one in which, and this is where I've kind of started to have some concern over the past few months, with a much more acute awareness of the limitations of what we can demand. Does that make sense? Because that would be a grave misunderstanding to suggest that we should not engage in this, precisely to do it, but with an acute sense of our limitations. Is that okay? Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeremy Clare. I want to, this is for Ed, just returning to the thought process you went on during the development of Wissenschaft. Around halfway through, you used a very striking phrase, which was freed from theology. Mm-hmm. They went on to And the word freed implied to me that their perception was that theological perspectives represented some sort of control or constraint or even imprisonment that they needed to get out of. And then you went on to talk about pursuit of knowledge, tireless and industrious, and a timeless community of scholars pursuing truth. Did it not occur to them that perhaps much of that truth was contained within theology, and by abandoning it altogether and feeling they were outside of those constraints, they might have missed something in the development of their thought?
I would absolutely say yes. And so yeah, the language is rituals, right? And it was celebrated that the autonomy of kind of philological inquiry, but philology is simply a stand-in for modern forms of knowledge for these 19th century German kind of scholars. And the claim was precisely that, that philology was the ideal modern discipline because it was the first to have freed itself from theological constraints. There are a number of ironies there. One, and this is kind of in my last book, I wrote a lot about this, is that philology, of course, emerged out of deeply theological traditions. In fact, the first philology seminars, the first graduate seminars that we kind of know of, were in Germany in 1812, but those emerged out of seminaries, right? And in the seminaries of the early 18th century, the pietist seminaries, like in Halle and Leipzig, they trained philologists and classicists in biblical languages, and there's a direct connection there. So one, it's historically fanciful, right, kind of on the face of it. But your second point, what I take to be your second point, this odd, perhaps, or what struck you as kind of an odd notion of the truth, I think that's precisely what's going on over the course of the 19th century. Very, very much like kind of proleptic anticipation of the consensus-based notion of neutrality in the mid-20th century in the United States. You have basically a crisis of Wissenschaft in the last third of the 19th century, and what it's concerned with is when I talk about this tirelessness, everybody gets really tired, right? If truth is something that's eternally deferred, you have a crisis of the very concept of what constitutes and how we relate to truth, because you have no reference point within which and through which to understand when one might rest, for example, when one might receive and be grateful for knowledge. Those concepts drop out. And there is a Lorraine Daston, I don't know, she's a historian of science at the Max Planck Institute. She's currently writing a beautiful book precisely about this, is that the invention of modern science happens in the last third of the 19th century when scientists give up on the notion of truth. And what they do instead is collect massive, and this is the first kind of emergence of what I call, I've written on the big humanities and these massive data sets. So Germans, all these things that we're all very thankful for, these 50-volume compendia type things, they all occur in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, first 2 decades of the 20th century, because the notion is that since they can't have truth, well, at least they can collect the data such that in some eschatological scholarly future, scholars may be able to interpret and engage that. So it's, that quote is just an anticipation of a massive crisis, and I think Weber is kind of speaking at the very end of that, this lament.
Yes.
I want to start by thanking Professors Wellman and Rubin for 2 very fascinating and informative papers. I enjoyed them both tremendously. My question is actually for Professor Rubin. And so I'd like to repeat back to some of what I thought I heard you say in case I'm not quite getting it right. But you had said that, well, I guess I'll make an observation first, which is that often both in the event yesterday and also today, it sort of seems like trouble seems to accompany the entrance of people of color into the institution. We're hearing it in words like multicultural or pluralistic, or the kinds of activities that come up when people from fundamentally different positioning, enter and have something to say. So you had indicated that one of the critiques in, I think, the 80s, early 90s, of some of these students are that universities are tools of or reproduce the status quo. So I think you characterize then the response of universities as moving from one kind of neutrality, so consensus, to another kind, which is the marketplace of ideas. And I think you characterize it as the nadir of universities teaching plurality.
Mhm.
So it seems to me that, and then you ended by saying that we should come back, we should work our way back to consensus. And I think that's probably right. I think that's part of what we're doing here today. But it seems that the critique itself has not necessarily been addressed. And that returning to any sort of consensus will require that that critique is addressed in some way. And that the consensus, or the space of consensus, neutrality might itself have to move. So anyway, I'm just wondering if you agree with that, or
Yeah.
what response you might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that comment. So the critique, why we often associate it with the opening up of university space to a broader population, particularly in the United States, African Americans, and then after the United States opens up its immigration laws and allows immigration to increase and immigration from new parts of the world to begin, particularly Asia and Latin America, then the university is also dealing not just with African Americans, but also with Asian Americans and Latinos and other people. But the critique actually happens before that influx. The critique begins really in the late 1950s and it continues and grows with intensity by the late 1960s. But the critique was a reasonable one. The university, in a way, had become too aligned to particular political and cultural ideas. And the Cold War created a sort of rigidity in universities around that consensual space. So in many universities, and hundreds of faculty were fired during the Cold War, and universities policed themselves too much. And they also aligned themselves in both their intellectual inquiry and in other policies, aligned themselves too much with a particular political vision. And so in the 1950s and then growing in the 1960s, there's a legitimate pushback against that consensus having become too narrow, too rigid. And universities, and then it was complicated by other groups, first African Americans, then women, talking about the critique in a different way, not in this kind of narrow Cold War vision, economic vision, but also in terms of not taking into consideration the cultural creations of outside the West as legitimate, and also not taking in the perspectives of people who had not been included in that old consensus. So I believe that consensual space was outdated and needed to be changed. But the turmoil made it impossible at that point in time to begin to think about how to change it. And universities then responded instead by saying, okay, we'll remove those too narrow limitations. We'll make academic freedom equal freedom of speech. We'll allow Marxists and feminists and into the space of the university, but we will just not take any position. And they also really stepped back from trying to use the extracurricular as a kind of moral formation. It was like, all sorts of rules were dropped, and there was a sort of just students were kind of allowed sort of to do anything. And then in the 1990s, there really had to be some narrowing of this because there was a lot of chaos on campus. But there was also sort of a sense that, yeah, there's all these new voices, but they're only talking to really limited audiences. And people wanted to create a new kind of general education. But the conditions made it hard, and finding consensus in this new, broader world will be hard. I don't have any illusion that there will be lots of disagreement. The issue is, should the university try to push its faculty and its sector, not just its own institution, but broadly, should it try to engage people in finding what the consensus for this moment in time is? Even though we know it is an unstable one, it will be challenged, and even though we know there will be disagreement around the edge, it's just, do we have a responsibility to do that? And I think that we should try to do that. And I think that, yes, I agree with what Chad said, that often when we do try to do it, there's, we find that our faculty are very untrained, uncertain, unwilling. But I think that's something that universities have to take responsibility for. They train those faculty. So we need to train the new faculty to be able to engage in that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
My name is David Grimes. Chad, can I ask you a question? I'm surprised by your talk for two reasons. First of all, before Max Weber was philology, and Max Weber was the change moment. In my understanding, the British universities in the 19th century, what was important was moral philosophy and classics. And the change moment was logical positivism. And I think that once we had a university, I know both Oxford and Cambridge, which believed in the sorts of things that a study of moral philosophy, including of the classics, would bring to the formation of character. And by the end of the 1930s, this had been declared as impossible. And these are very strongly collegiate institutions. You might say these are just kind of 2.5 philosophers in each university. But the impact of these in a corporate body with this radical thought was, I think, all pervasive and incredibly important. I don't think it was Max Weber at all.
So I don't know if I understand your question correctly. What wasn't Max Weber declaring an end to classics as a source of moral formation, or what was?
Your talk had Weber as a center of the talk.
Yeah,
what
right.
came before Weber was, in your talk, philology.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure that either philology was what was important before, or that the center of your talk should have been about Weber.
Okay, I see. Well, I can't speak for Oxbridge, but I think I can make a claim in the German context that philology definitely was the exemplary science, precisely as you say, because the bet was, originally speaking at least, with the neo-humanists of the early 19th century and the German kind of professionalization of philology, that the classics, ancient antiquity, was the primary moral resource. I mean, Nietzsche, as a philologist, definitely claimed that. And all of the kind of modern German sciences, the Prussian Academy of Sciences, they had either a philologist or a historian as secretary until the last century, until the last decade of the 19th century, right? And the Germans, kind of invented the laboratory-based sciences in terms of the scale at which they operated. So, the key there, and I think this is where you're right on the money, is that all of those, whether you were a natural scientist or a philologist, you had been trained in the gymnasium, right? You had gotten an Abitur, and you knew Latin and Greek. And so there was a common neo-humanist culture before you even got to the university. And that had always been the assumption. Regardless of how fragmented and specialized modern science is rendering knowledge, we have this common core in antiquity. And that's when I said a certain faith, and there was a faith that could remake us, right? That we could renew ourselves and still be a common culture. And the doubts about that, in Germany at least, maybe, I'm not sure, I can't speak for Oxford, really only start to become acute in the first decades of the 20th century, and the entire project seems to fail. And these are wrapped up with anxieties about pressure from the state to let in more people into the gymnasium, right? Women in particular, anxieties. They're not allowed into universities until 1910, at least the University of Berlin. So I really do see Weber as kind of pronouncing an end to all of those common culture desires grounded in this kind of neo-humanist vision. But maybe I've misunderstood what you're asking.
One more question.
Thank you, Chris Sedgwick, Oxford Centre for Religion and Public Life, and the Oxford Pastorate. There are at least two of us in this room who studied grades here in the 60s. That is Latin, Greek, and philosophy, who were in the Michael Charles lecture theatre. Building on what the last speaker said, would there not also be a parallel explanation that the fact-value distinction that was central to logical positivism actually then made that the pursuit of truth was then through statistics, through surveys, which put social studies at the centre of the discovery of truth, and also history. So you have now no platforming, whether that's no platforming of Roads Must Fall, or no platforming of Jeremy Corbyn supported the IRA and Hezbollah. But that fact-value distinction, it seems to me, is fundamental to some of the problem, for which the answer surely is there's no value-free fact.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think what's happening is that in different national contexts, certain the fact-value distinction comes into prominence through different disciplines and things, but throughout the Western world, somewhere in the early 20th century, whether it's being driven through philosophy, switching to logical positivism, whether it's being driven from social scientists accepting this idea of value-free inquiry, whether it's being driven by biologists and other scientists trying to say that, we're not going to address big questions like the origins of life, we're going to address the mechanisms of cellular development. I think throughout there becomes a sense in which modern inquiry accepts this idea that it has to have a narrow focus on fact, and that values will make the inquiry corrupt because they won't allow for consensus through verification. And that happens in different ways in different nations. And then there's a big vacuum. And since that point, there's been various ways of coping with that vacuum, one of which is to simply stand back on that idea that, well, we all are virtuous because the professional tasks that we're involved in just leads us to be focused on fact and open inquiry and carefulness, and we have all of these, personal virtues through our professional training. But that just leaves our students, only the students that are going to follow in that path will get that kind of virtue. And that is an inadequate answer for our students. It might be an adequate answer for ourselves, but not for our students. And we've often let that go. But I think that there have been and there can be attempts to not simply step back, but look for ways to make it part of our vocation to try to answer those questions, even though we tell our students these are not eternal answers. And that's sort of the big difference. We can't find eternal answers anymore, but that doesn't mean that we don't look for any answers.
Please join me in thanking Professors Wellman and Rubin.
Sorry if I overtook my time.